Hi, welcome to Bay Nature Talks. My name is Victoria Schlesinger. I'm the editor of Bay Nature Magazine. If you're new to Bay Nature Magazine, we are a nonprofit independent media organization that reports on the environment in the San Francisco Bay Area and beyond. Today's conversation particularly is beyond. We've been in publication for about 20 years, and the majority of our funding comes from donations. So if you have donated to Bay Nature, thank you. We're here because of you. And if you're new to Bay Nature, welcome. Today, we are talking about living on public lands. What does that mean? Who's doing it? Why are they doing it? What are the impacts on the land? And joining me in conversation are three people who have particular expertise and a variety of expertise in the subject. So without further ado, let me welcome my three panelists. Let me introduce Anthony Khalil, who is a program manager at the Bayview Hunters Point Community Advocates Organization. He's the organization's food sovereignty and ecological restoration specialist. He's also an environmental justice advisor to the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, BCDC. So welcome, Anthony. We also have Sarah Tory with us, who is a freelance environmental journalist. She's written for national and international publications. She reported Bay Nature's fall issue cover story for Bay Nature and High Country News about living on public lands in the West. She's joining us from Colorado. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And finally, Lee Cerveny is a research social scientist with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station. And in 2015, Lee and others published research on the rising number of people living on public lands. And she continues to study that issue and is joining us from Seattle today. Welcome, Lee.
Thanks, Al. It's great to be here.
So thanks everybody for being here, and just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. The four of us will be talking for about the next 40 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes at the end for questions. So folks who are listening, please just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any time, send us questions, and in the last 20 minutes of this conversation, we'll circle back around and try to answer as many of them as we can. This conversation is being recorded and will live on Bay Nature's website. We will also send out an email with a URL to the recorded conversation to folks who have joined the conversation today. So let's see, without further ado, let's get into what does it mean to live on public lands. That's a broad phrase that has a lot of meaning. Different meanings behind it. So I just want to start with that part of the conversation, and then there's lots of other pieces of it we'll get into. Who is living on public land? Why are they living on public land? What is the impact on the land? So let's start with you, Sarah, since your feature story for Bay Nature and High Country News is really the inspiration for us being here today. Why don't you just start by telling us about the family that you reported on and why and where they were living on public lands? Let's begin there.
Yeah, Stephen and Kanisha are the mom and dad, along with their 4 kids, the family I met here in Colorado, which is in Western Colorado. I met them sort of in June. Maybe it was early July, I can't remember. I think it was June actually. And they are originally they're in their early 30s, originally from San Diego, but were priced out of there around 5 years ago, moved to Las Vegas where they heard housing was cheaper. And housing prices eventually started rising there too. And they just sort of got fed up with the way felt they were being forced to live there, sort of working all the time to make rent, not being able to give their kids sort of the holistic lifestyle more wholesome lifestyle, I guess, connected to nature, outdoor experiences that they really wanted. And one day, Kenesha sort of happened upon a YouTube video about a family kind of like theirs, a bunch of kids, to a mom and dad who are camping full time. And that was sort of the impetus for this big life change that they decided to make. They realized, if this family can do it, why don't we try it, since we're not happy with our life here in Las Vegas. They sold most of their possessions, got a used minivan, and drove away from Las Vegas, sort of seeking out national forest land and BLM land. And their plan was just to, live in these places that they felt they couldn't access from Las Vegas, and do that they didn't really have an end date, just for as long as they could.
And so for folks who don't really know what dispersed camping is, that is part of what the Kenesha and Stephen are doing. And can you just explain in general terms what dispersed camping is, so we know that everybody knows?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, dispersed camping is crucially, it's free. You can do it in many places, although there's regulations in some areas, but essentially means you're not staying in sort of an established campground. There's no amenities, no toilets, no running water. You have to be self-sufficient. It's, often as simple as just driving down kind of a forest road, a dirt road, and stopping at maybe there's a pullout, and you just park your car there and put up your tent or sleep in your car.
Usually there's folks usually stay.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there's usually a 14-day limit for any one particular location, although there are some long-term visitor areas on BLM land, kind of out in the desert, where folks have the option of staying for a longer period of time.
And is the idea then, if they stay in that place for 14 days, then where do they need to move to next if they want to continue to stay on public land? I just want people to understand the rigors of this life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're supposed to move sort of no closer than 30 miles from where you last were, to stay within the rules.
Yeah. And so Lee, your research and your work with the National Forest Service really touches this very directly. Can you tell us a little bit about the research that you've done and who you found and where they were living on public lands?
Sure. Well, this research started back in 2015, and the impetus for the study came when I was actually on a field trip in the Willamette National Forest in Oregon. And we were visiting at a dispersed roadside campsite under a bridge along the Mackenzie River in Oregon. The staff member who was giving us the tour of this site was talking about some of the concerns at this dispersed site related to vegetation damage and social trails and erosion and water quality. And then as an thought, she kind of mentioned that this was an area that was actually visited often by homeless campers. And so when I asked her more about what was going on and what was driving homeless campers to the site, she pointed down the road and said, well, there's a bus stop half a mile down the road, and they can go to town and get mail and services. So that kind of clued me in that this forest setting was particularly hospitable to homeless campers, and that connection to the town or to the city was really important. So I got very interested in this topic and partnered with Joshua Bauer at San Jose State, and we were trying to figure out ways to measure what was going on nationwide in all national forests in terms of people camping on public lands. So as you know and can guess, counting people out in an outdoor setting can be really hard, and forest dwellers are often intentionally discreet. So we knew that wasn't going to work. So we decided to start by reaching out to law enforcement officers in the Forest Service. So we did a national survey of all law enforcement officers throughout the whole country to get their impressions and experiences of encounters with homeless and non-recreational campers. So we asked them a number of studies about how often they encountered non-recreational campers, whether the number of encounters had increased or decreased over time, what types of campers that they had encountered, what sites they were choosing to stay in, and then some of the impacts associated with long-term camping on those sites, both the biophysical and also the social dimensions associated with that. So we had 290 people respond to our survey, which was at the time more than half of the folks, law enforcement officers in the Forest Service. And we learned a lot that helped us to understand more about this, what was going on throughout all the forests.
And so you used a couple different terms there, and maybe we'll circle back to this, but you used homeless campers and non-recreational campers, and that begins to touch on one of these bigger topics today of how do we talk about this? Who are we talking about when we use those different terms? But before we dive into that, let's go to you, Anthony, and your area, physical area where you are spending a lot of time in Bayview Hunters Point in San Francisco, and specifically the safe parking RV site that is anticipated there. Can you just tell listeners what that site is and when it's supposed to begin, so we just begin to lay the groundwork?
Absolutely. Yeah. Greetings and gratitude to everyone in this virtual space. I want to recognize that we're all coming in from many different places. I'm calling in from traditional Ohlone lands here in San Francisco, and I want to recognize that. I also want to recognize that we are coming in from many different points and intersections, and where we connect is at this very complex and intriguing, an ancient topic around the public living on public lands, and how we define, and we've already mentioned this topic of how we categorize, and I want to recognize specifically the research that Ms. Cervantes, Lee, you were working on, and how the category of over 10 different types of how to classify who lives on public lands, which is very comprehensive. And Sarah, for sharing more of an intimate portrait of what is one of these categories, what is just one example of the broad. So sharing this overview and zoning into my community and how this is a very hot topic here in southeastern San Francisco. And what we mean by that, at the first urban state park adjacent to the Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood at Candlestick State Recreation Area, is a proposed site for a vehicle triage center. To break down the semantics of that, it's essentially a safe space for here's another term that we can break down later. We refer to it internally in a lot of the people that I associate with as our unhoused neighbors or unsheltered neighbors, which is a lot to unpack at times. So it's one that I feel comfortable with. I don't know if that would show up in other forms, but in this situation, it's unhoused neighbors. So to break that down further, it's understanding that folks have always lived on the streets and public lands in areas of different, and I want to return to this jurisdictional oversight and natural resource management, which I think is so apparent in the mosaic of the Bay Area, where I'm from, and the communities that I serve. So in connection to how the federal management of certain sites is, and referring to campers as non-recreational, and using that codified, or in regards to how a state would manage the situation. Here you have this nexus of state, of federal, of private, of public, as well as on top of all that, the city where this resides. So really, it is a hot topic that is very current in regards to what is the next phase of a solution. So I hope to dig into that further. But really, zoning out from where it's happening here, we see this as ubiquitous, and we see many forces that contribute to the fact that folks are living on public lands in a much different way that maybe they have 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 and so on.
Yeah. And so just to, for folks who may not have been aware of the news, so what Anthony's talking about is just that the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco is on the precipice of fully approving, no reason to think that they wouldn't, 150 RVs being in a small portion of Candlestick State Recreation Area for 2 years. There will be services there of all sorts. And maybe you can speak more about that, Anthony.
Yeah. Forgive me for not elaborating more, and you filled in a lot of the key details. It is a work in progress. It's furthering that, like I'm saying, it's a hot topic, which means that this project is seeking to be fully enacted as of early next year. This process started about mid 2020, which is the height, as we know, of the crucible, that kind of illuminated and maybe prompted us into even this discussion today on how do we deal with things that we have cast as away. I think we consider sometimes as a society unhoused population, homelessness, how we manage our waste, how we produce our goods. It just goes away. But when we start to illuminate this and a crucible such as a public health crisis does, it puts it at the forefront. So all this research that Sarah and Lee has done, on a national level, mirrors our experiences here, where it's a daily situation where you can't be a recluse, where you can't be an introvert. And currently, there's sites already enacted throughout San Francisco that are active, safe sites that have some high-tech recreational vehicles, which are campers, new and currently owned by unhoused neighbors or neighbors who live within campers. As another term, recreational vehicles, RVs. I know I'm throwing out different terms, but I'm trying to really do this in a way to understand people see, and it when folks perhaps are living in those situations, and we're having to deal with real uncomfortable situations and transition to hopefully a less comfortable situation by working together.
And can you say just a little bit more, help us know who the neighbors are? And that's a compelling term to me. Does that mean that these are folks who've been living in the Bayview and were in traditional housing previously? Who's there?
And I'll share briefly on that. And I also want to hear from Lee and Sarah, because I saw a lot of connections with the types of folks who might we came across in our own research or service to these communities. So yes, there is legacy residents who have fell on hard times, as lack for a better terms, and some of that has been highlighted even in the Chronicle and in our own Bay Nature magazine here. However, there's this also, going back to the point that I brought up around forces of migration of the national as well as international, not only housing crisis, but the economic pressures and crises that affects a subset of folks. It doesn't affect all equally. And a lot of the research that I've seen and have experienced, and what I mean by that, these are folks who might have legacy connections to San Francisco, the Bay Area, California. There's also folks that have migrated from the South, from parts that, we're talking Texas or other parts that, housing might be cheap, but there's no, they've been ostracized. The workforce has vanished, because of the global market. You also have, the monolingual populations where English isn't even a second language. These are folks who, and so maybe taking a step back, I'm giving some broad brushstrokes. I can say this because I walk the streets with these folks. These are neighbors, and that's a term that maybe I didn't have my whole life, but I'm open to it, and the more we can be open to that type of change and shift within ourselves, we can manage a situation differently.
Yeah, thanks. Lee, why don't you speak more about what Anthony touched on, the different groupings that you've the way you've tried to capture the breadth of who is living on public lands. And Anthony's talking about some of those, but why don't you expand for us?
Sure, and I think Anthony said something important earlier too, that this isn't a new phenomenon. We've had for many generations people residing and living on public lands for different reasons, and thinking back to pioneers coming across our country, or refugees from the Dust Bowl and others who, for various reasons, resided on public lands to escape economic hardship and other things. So I think it's really important to look at that historical context. And then for this study, we were really concerned about language. And that's why we ended up landing on the term non-recreational campers for the context of this study within the Forest Service. We wanted to get away from social stigma and assumptions attached to the word homeless and homelessness that might be conjured up when we talk to law enforcement officers for the survey. So really we used non-recreational campers to signify those residing on national forest lands or exceeding their stay limitations, which typically is about 14 days.
Mm-hmm.
But I did want to mention that we have heard other terms being used. Some of them are less favorable than others, but forest dwellers, residers, squatters, these are some things that terms that we've heard before. But I guess I just wanted to say language is important, and we need to consider the variety of forms of people who are using public spaces as temporary residents, and be careful in how we think and talk about that. But for our study, we looked at the academic literature and built on some existing typologies to come up with 10 different kinds of people who live outdoors. And I'll just mention those quickly and then share with you a couple of the things that we found in the study. But the 10 different groups we identified were solitary or antisocial individuals. Often those are veterans and folks who really want to be alone in nature. Families or single parents with children. Large communal or countercultural groups. And one example might be the Rainbow Family, which is a group that moves around and lives in different national forests across the country. We also mentioned forest workers. These might be forest harvesters or folks who live and work in the woods. Then we have recreational and amenity workers. These could be ski instructors or outfitter guides who work in the forest temporarily over the seasons. We also talked about informal gatherings of homeless individuals and adults as a group. Transient retirees, and those might be people living in campers or vans or RVs.
And let me just back up. So that group in particular, that's Nomadland. That's what that entire Frances McDermott film was about. And then the group just before that was what again?
We call them, for the survey, we
Yeah.
call them informal gatherings of homeless adults.
Okay.
So
all right. And so, for example, you were talking about in Willamette, under the bridge, that's those folks who were a quarter mile from the bus stop.
Exactly.
On that group. Okay.
Yeah. And then there are other groups too, university and college students. And I just had a long conversation last week with a woman who was working on her graduate degree at a university in a Western city and living on the national forest for 2 years while she got a master's in biology. And so, and then there are other groups like teens living in the forest together as a group, and then folks who are wanted by the law, fugitives or others who are wanted by the law. So those are the 10 different groups that we came up with when we approached law enforcement officers with the survey. And that we were really interested in our findings. We found that the most frequent encounters for these law enforcement officers were with that group transient retirees.
Mm-hmm.
It really surprised us. I guess we thought it would be groups of homeless adults, but nearly half of the people we talked to said that they met transient retirees at least once a month. And this was particularly the case in the southwestern states and in southern Colorado and other places where maybe the weather's a bit warmer.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next common group that we encountered was that group of homeless adults, and quickly followed by families. So we're seeing many different kinds of groups living in these outdoor settings.
Sarah, why don't you chime in with your reporting? How did your on the ground reporting sort of match up with some of what Lee's just talked about in terms of the type of people that you encountered and reported on?
Yeah, I would say that it sort of touches on a few, not all of the categories Lee describes, but definitely Stephen and Kanisha would fall into the family category. A lot of the folks I talked to were sort of pushed or had chosen to live on forest land in their vehicles or in tents out of due to economic crises. One man, during the pandemic, he lost his job, couldn't afford anything, had moved into his vehicle, and then later when he got some money, bought a school bus, I think, and fixed it up, and then eventually came to embrace that lifestyle. And he said he's never, living in four walls in a real house again, and really came to, but then, other people are really in sort of more desperate circumstances, and it's not this sort of honeymoon vacation type reality that I think some people have through Instagram or whatnot. And, a woman who I heard about in Mammoth had been living in her truck for years and was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt and really struggling. And she was living there out of necessity. She couldn't afford anything. But yeah, the high cost of housing in a lot of places in the West, particularly in mountain communities, is what had driven a lot of people I talked to live on public land.
Can you tell us a little bit about Dirk Addis, another person that you featured in the story?
Yeah, Dirk sort of kind of as a hybrid, I guess. He could afford to rent a place, but he just didn't want to pay, over half his income to renting a tiny studio or a bedroom with multiple roommates in Mammoth Lakes in the Eastern Sierra, where, like many resort towns, there's very little affordable housing. And so he decided to just live out of his van on the forest land surrounding town, and had been doing that since the early 2000s, and, came to sort of embrace it in his own way. That's not to say it's not hard. That's not to say he wouldn't, if there was a plot of land or affordable house available, he would probably take it, but that's not the case. So yeah, that was Dirk. And lots of people that's what's pushed a lot of people to live on public land in communities like Mammoth.
He had some pretty choice words about Airbnb. You want to speak to that and what that's some of the changes to the rental market?
Yeah, I think I won't repeat his exact words, but you can read the story to find out, but he had really seen how, there weren't a lot of good options when he came to Mammoth in the early 2000s, not a lot of affordable housing like many places in the Sierra, many mountain resort communities, Tahoe will be the same. But then when Airbnb came along, it really strained this already very tight housing market, because a lot of the long-term rentals that locals, second, vacation condos that people had that they would rent long-term to locals, they took those off the market and just made them nightly rentals on Airbnb. So that really wiped out a lot of, what little existing affordable housing was there for the local workforce. So he really saw that and was very, he did not mince his words when describing the impact that the Airbnb and I guess VRBO too had on his community.
I'm really interested, Anthony, to hear your thoughts about when you hear about that community, some of those community members that Sarah's talking about, and what is the distance between the community you're part of and working with and some of those folks. My sense talking about this over time is actually, it's not as big a leap as we might imagine, but that's my impression. I'm really interested to hear.
Yeah, well, there is common threads, let's and I spoke about those already, and I'll refer to them again. Let's talk about the forces of migration. There's a lot of we haven't brought up privilege and the role that this plays in it, because when I hear about these different categories, I attach kind of that spectrum of privilege on them. Personally, myself, I think it's much harder for me to make the choice to be a vagabond and a bohemian living off the grid than it might be for someone else. I want to also highlight another point that was brought up around veterans and understanding the overwhelming majority of our unhoused population, whether it be in an urban setting or a rural setting, is absolutely the veteran population. And when we think about the psychological trauma of that and the impacts of how the global industrial complex. So, I'm getting really macro when I refer to what are the forces that have created this episode to be so apparent, and currently why it's such a topic right now, when we've always had to manage this as a society, as natural resource managers. We haven't even talked about the fact that, a lot of this, okay, and this is, now I'm going to get into where there's a distinction, is where some of this non-recreational camping happens in BLM land. For the most part, it is on very pristine, I would say, regenerated, restored land. Some of it, byways and access roads. So yes, it isn't in the heart of Yosemite for us here in California, and in the valley there, or at. However, it is in clean land. Okay, and what I mean by that is it might have multiple uses, but it doesn't have the urban industrial toxicity that folks like the neighbors that I've been serving that are being, what do we do? What do we do, as a city? How do we manage this? Because, we can't just turn a blind eye, here it is again, and say, well, I went up that road and I didn't see anybody, but we know that there may be over the bend and over yonder, because it's so much, and it is a pristine land. But when in an urban setting, what really even prompted the center to be so urgent is here's a catch right now, is how do you communicate climate changes and the effects of that? The neighborhood here, which is adjacent to the bay, okay, is it in the shadows of where I grew up, going to Candlestick Park and not really knowing all the complexities that surrounds what's this piece of land, right, as a boy. And you think about how climate change, this atmospheric river, I'll talk about all these new terms, I didn't have that one growing up, but atmosphere, it shows, people are really thinking about this stuff. It's wonderful. But if we're thinking deeply about it, and the climate change impacted a long-term homeless population that was magnified recently by the pandemic, okay, it's because it was flooded out of control, and that's because the infrastructure was overburdened by this atmospheric river. So people were standing in water, the city, it had to shut the street, right? Before, we just had people living on the streets, and we have to manage it, as people living here, as city workers who have to clean it up and have to respond to complaints as well as support from the public, right? The accountability piece, and they can't ever get it right. We can't ever get it right. I understand that, but we also can't allow people who are already unsheltered to basically drown in their own detritus and just say, we can't put them on a lot, maybe a mile or two away, because that's, we didn't fix the problem before. Well, this ain't a 1-year problem. This ain't a 2-year problem. Okay. And I'm forgive me for using the term even problem, because it's the collective responsibility, especially in an urban setting, where there is no real pristine places, and someone like me who has dedicated their professional career to trying to restore our biodiversity and our most precious habitat on the shorelines that people are also living on. We need a little bit more help than community-based organizations and project-based management of this. Because I wanted, my last point here before I turn it back, thank you, Victoria, and others for bearing with me on this, is I've said this very often, is, how can we respond to this? I feel like, say, for instance, here, especially many folks on this webinar are part of the Bay Area community, understand that the Golden Gate National Recreation Area and the conservancy approach that they manage their public land with is top notch. But where they can fall short is the equitable approach for that, and who lives on the adjacent neighborhoods is very distinct from where I'm at, okay? Even though the ecological value is of the same. You think they don't have homeless issues over on the west side? Absolutely, of course they do. But the management and the humility in the approach is managed differently, and everyone can be accountable, as well as, and I think they're doing a phenomenal job. So we don't need to recreate a whole different model. It's just letting folks who are the most impacted by this take leadership. So this is a little glimmer of that here, even with all its discord and discourse and static, to see what is the next step. It's a bold step that we haven't really seen
the
before.
RV safe space.
Coming back to something of that nature. Or saying we understand we didn't fix the problem previously, and we couldn't because we basically were blind to it as a society. But maybe we can start managing and understanding what really is it. Who are the people living there? What is their challenges?
So when the concern that I know Sarah encountered, I'd like to hear about that, Lee, that you've researched, and then Anthony, you're touching on, so why don't you keep going, is that, well, what are the impacts on the land? And this is land that you and the community and others, Anthony, have spent time restoring and trying to restore, and people have anxiety about that. And how do you respond to that? How do you respond to people's anxiety, Anthony, about
I think, Lee, if you want to start us, I would love to hear your perspective. Great. Please share.
Sure. I guess I can talk about the context of the national forest, which is what I was looking at. And then I also just wanted to touch on something Anthony talked about related to climate change. But we asked law enforcement officers what some of the biophysical and social effects were of long-term encampments on national forest sites. And the biggest things that came up for them were trampled soils, trampled vegetation, illegally cut trees, litter, trash and garbage, sanitation and waste, human waste and pet waste, because a lot of people living in outdoor settings have pets, water pollution, and dumping of hazardous materials. And some of that is from cars or vehicles that aren't operable anymore. And maybe there's some leakage of those vehicles. We also heard about unauthorized fires, which brings me to some of the conversation. There has been some conversation about people who are homeless potentially being causes of some of the wildfires we've seen in California, which I think we'll see how that plays out. But I think of more concern is the vulnerability of people who are houseless and homeless, who are living in rural settings, who may be in harm's way when it comes to catastrophic wildfire, large wildfire, as well as flooding and landslides. I'm in Seattle area, and this week we're having incredible flooding in the northern, near the Canadian border, an incredible loss of lives. And I think an important question to be thinking about, and that's on the minds of folks in the National Forest Service, is how do we protect people who are living in dispersed settings from some of the climate-induced weather patterns that we're seeing.
And Sarah, two things jump to mind that I would love to hear you talk about from your story. One, speaking of flooding and conditions when Kenesha and Stephen were faced with, and also some of what you heard from folks in Mammoth who said they were concerned about the impacts on the land.
Yeah, here in my part of Colorado, we had a pretty wet summer, sort of starting in kind of late July, a really heavy monsoon compared to previous years. And the dispersed camping area where Kenesha and Stephen were living, sort of a few miles outside of Carbondale, was down this dirt road that basically turned to mud and was completely impassable when it rained heavily. And so they were really dealing with that. They were finding it, difficult to get into town to get supplies, for Stephen to get to his job, which he had to take because their car broke down and he needed money for a new vehicle. So it caused a lot of problems for them, and that they hadn't anticipated. And then on the other side of the spectrum in Mammoth, starting last year with the Creek Fire, that had led to huge concerns around just the threat of wildfires. And there was this influx of dispersed campers who came in from Southern California to sort of escape their pandemic confinement. And that led to huge local concerns that they would start they didn't start the creek fire, but that there was just this heightened awareness and fear of wildfires, and that with all these visitors, something similar would happen, and people were really concerned. And that was sort of their concerns were getting channeled towards local people who were using the forest as shelter. People like Dirk, who, you know, had been maybe living there for a long time and, you know, followed the rules, knew the rules around wildfires and I mean, around campfires and whatnot, but it sort of exploded a little bit with many people just calling for an outright ban on dispersed camping because of the threat of wildfires. And yeah, it just sort of blew up a little bit, just this sort of conflation of issues.
Lee, do you see people calling for a ban on dispersed camping?
I think that's been a conversation in some areas, either having a ban on dispersed camping or restricting limits even further to shorter stays or fewer days. I don't know, I can't talk about any specific examples where that's actually happened on the ground, but it's certainly something that's being talked about in the media and in some of the community-based conversations around this topic. Because, well, just a quick follow-up is that I think what Sarah talked about is important because the communities adjacent to the forest are beginning to have this sense of fear about some of this dispersed camping, and many of the conversations are kind of coming from that direction. And it's I think it brings up this very important tension, I think, that we have about who are these public lands for, and how do we manage them in a way that's sustainable and safe for all.
And I know we are bleeding into our question time, but so folks, go ahead and send in your questions, and then I'd like to hear Anthony's thoughts on this piece, the impact on restored land piece.
Yeah, I would say the real narrow mind is looking at it that, you know, trampled paths, fires, tire dumps, and there's some real nefarious activity, y'all. I'm serious. You know, we could do a whole story on what I've termed as like the metal mining that goes on still, you know, across the Bay Area, the desperation that people that don't have jobs living in these situations are forced to do or exploited. You know, I'm casting a wide net, right? And, you know, I couldn't even share on this webinar what I've witnessed, okay? And I speak to that very truthful here. I also understand that we touched upon this. There's just like there's the working poor, you know, or you know, you can work but not have a home, you know, and so many of us maybe know someone like that who's, you know, or a family like that, or a group of people like that. So these folks that we've mentioned and talked about, just for lack, you know, for lack of time, we said here's different groups, right? It's like a you know, the stream, the big water flow, and here's the different streams that they all are a part of. And so when you think about just their small and sometimes very impactful ecological impact, you know, I think it's more of what Lee was talking around, the stigmas and the lack of compassion and the ability to see beyond that in the situation that they're in. Yeah. It's I'm going to admit, it's really difficult as a wetland ecologist who's dedicated my lives, how much it means for, say, if someone stepped on a Sueda californica, okay, which is California sea blight. It's a very special and sacred plant, which is federally listed as endangered, which I had the privilege to help restore and bring back to the Bay. Okay, so if I knew one of these people somehow, you know, trampled one of those, and we lost a federally listed endangered Sueda californica, California sea blight, okay, yes, I would be devastated. But I'm more devastated by the radiological toxicity that was left by the military that we're dealing with in regards to toxic tides, and how many folks maybe on this call are aware that, you know, looking at the Bay Adapt Plan and how, you know, in my role as an advisor with the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, we take these matters very seriously. And even more so, this intersection of the most marginalized are feeling the pressures of not only climate change, but the whole atmosphere, the change of the atmosphere of our economy, the ecology of one another. So yes, there is negative impact. And yes, it's really tragic. But until we can really come to the reckoning of the largest contributors to this, and go beyond just that small negative impact, for whatever reason, I think we can do multiple versions and education and compassion and innovative approaches, such as, say, a vehicle triage center that can put resources into that and put resources, into protection, conservation, preservation, representation, within our public lands. Okay. I'm also just, as we segue into our question and answer, I know there is a couple in there that should be answered and will be answered. Thinking about what I was saying around, yes, the value of biodiversity and the value of how we have the ability to use this period of impacts of climate change and the ones who are already feeling this and take a collective responsibility. So I really implore folks to monitor what's the next stages of this, because it's unwritten, and understanding that I'm talking only about this situation here in San Francisco, but I feel very conflicted, because I'm gonna share this with you all too. I helped establish and build some of the first campgrounds in San Francisco for our students, and people felt really good about that. As students, all having that ability to access and camp under the stars and be with nature, even in an urban setting, right? Those values. Well, these folks who lived unhoused now, they're not allowed into those camping situations, here in the city, because of the stigmas or the history that they're associated with. And they can't even get online, because it's all an online system to reserve these. So what can we offer? So just as much as we want to build campgrounds for our students, what can we build for folks who are unhoused and feeling the effects of not only climate change, but all the other historical vestiges?
I'm going to go to a question from Anne Pardee here. Says, any chance of hearing what administrators of public lands might be able to offer as spaces for dispersed camping? You want to take that, Lee?
Yeah, it is possible to go on to public lands and stay on public lands legally in most places up to 2 weeks in dispersed areas. And Sarah kind of described that earlier in our conversation. I have not heard specific conversations about taking those dispersed places and converting them into a more permanent or long-term campsites for houseless or homeless individuals. I've not heard that conversation. There was a few years ago, maybe about 20 years ago, in the Umatilla National Forest in Oregon, they did something like that. I believe it was about 6 months. They had a place on national forest lands there where there were long-term campers staying in a kind of monitored situation, but that experiment was stopped for reasons I don't know or understand. But I have not heard of anything, at least in national forest lands recently, that is moving in that direction.
And I know we don't have anybody here from state parks, but to Rich Wilkins' question, part of why we have this group of panelists is Anthony is talking about an RV safe space on state park land. And so this is a first that we're aware of people using public lands in this way. And a lot of what I think, Anthony, what you're talking about is how's this going to go and what's the opportunity here? Maybe there are other urban state parks, there are other urban parks. What are some of the other opportunities for the public lands as we're in? Yeah.
If I may add, part of the package of promised benefits currently is to staff the natural resource portion of the state parks, so enhance the staff there. So that is part of the benefits. That's something that's been lacking since the inception of the park, is an adequate staffing continuous to any state park, so there's parity there. Where there isn't. So there's also the ability to manage, I believe there is requests from the adjacent neighbors around enhancing the safety. So that it also involves different authority and that a different approach to managing that, which could turn into many different ways that I don't know what they'll become. But just to call out the fact that yes, we are trailblazing, where a public land is piloting something for 2 years. It might have a ripple effect into further state lands, into possibly in federal lands. And we can really show, in the small city here, how we can manage this situation.
We have a question here from Susan. How can you define and quantify people who are permanently living on public land? What's the impact on the land, and who pays for the cleanup, the garbage, and the waste?
I'll take a stab at that one. And I may have forgotten the first part of the question. We did talk earlier about some of the effects. I mentioned that earlier, some of the biophysical effects. One thing I didn't mention is that the cleanup costs for that can be significant. We did some estimates in one national forest, the Willamette National Forest in Central Oregon, which is near Eugene, Oregon. And they estimated that they spent in 2020 about $250,000 addressing all of the sites that they needed to remediate or clean up or mitigate after people had been moved from those sites. So it can be very expensive. Talking to some of the district rangers on a new study I'm working on, even the cost of hauling out abandoned vehicles can be in the tens of thousands sometimes. And it's hard to sometimes takes several weeks to make that happen with a lot of coordination among partners. And it's not just about the cost in terms of dollars, but it's also the cost in terms of staff time. And many of the public land management agencies are struggling with personnel and keeping capacity and human capacity. So when we have people spending time and resources to clean up sites, it takes those resources and people's time away from providing other services to the public. So those are some things to think about.
Shirley Park has a question. How does some of this intersect with housing regulation and laws? It seems to me like if we just improve public space with things like sanitation and internet access, a lot could be improved. Is there any political support to make public spaces more hospitable for people?
I can take a stab at that from my reporting in Mammoth. Due to the huge influx last summer in the Eastern Sierra of dispersed campers, there was discussions amongst local officials about how to better manage dispersed camping and some of the environmental impacts. And they created a cool app that shows you where it's legal to disperse camp and where it's not, because a lot of the problems last summer were around people illegally dispersed camping in places you're not allowed. But the signage was so bad and still isn't ideal physically on the forest land outside of Mammoth. It's really hard to tell, when you're in an area where you're allowed to and where you're not. So this app kind of has a GPS thing that you can pull it up and see, oh, I'm allowed to camp here, or no, I have to drive a mile down the road or whatnot. So that combined with there were, some volunteer stewards going out to popular areas to tell people the rules around, campfire bans and how to properly put out a campfire. There've been some dumpsters and porta potties put in to help manage the human waste and trash elements. And that had really helped the issue. One local I talked to who had been really concerned last summer mentioned that he was really encouraged by how these efforts had helped address a lot of the issues he'd had, and they were having a lot fewer issues this summer compared to last, which could of course also be because the pandemic wasn't as serious, but I think those efforts, the consensus had really helped address those issues.
Lee, are you seeing other suggestions and solutions for ways forward among your colleagues?
Yes, I mean, we have been, in addition to pointing out the challenges, we're talking about some strategies and approaches that are working. And a couple of the steps that we've seen that are moving forward are having Forest Service officials reach out and talk to other public land management agencies, other land stewards, maybe nonprofit or private land stewards, and social service agencies and health agencies within their county or whatever the appropriate scale, geographic scale is to address homelessness and houselessness in that region. So we're seeing more conversations happening at that kind of local level where people are coming together, bringing their resources together and looking, even just communicating and talking about the issue has been a big step. And then trying to combine and consolidate resources so that people can address some of the challenges has been really helpful. And one thing that's worked is having social service agencies come to frontline forest staff and do training on working with houseless populations, what kinds of questions to ask, how to identify if there might be risks or safety concerns, how to identify if there might be domestic abuse or other kinds of things going on. And I think we all saw in the news this past few weeks that domestic violence can be very difficult in some of these remote situations with people traveling and camping long term. So some of that on the ground training with frontline staff has been really successful. And even simple things like creating a brochure or gathering information so that law enforcement officers, when they're going out to these campsites, can help share and distribute information about where people can go for help with health or other kinds of needs. So these are some of the things that we've been hearing about.
Anthony, how does some of that sound similar or very different from what's now beginning to take place in the Safe RV site?
Well, I mentioned that 2020 was a crucible because it's obviously concocted something of a different form. And in regards to a different form, it's a different approach to something that existed. But I really want to recognize the Bayview Hunters Point housed community, who recognize I would say the overwhelming majority, and this is, just the feeling, understands that, just like our waste doesn't just go away, or the things that we don't want to deal with doesn't magically vanish. We can't just ship off, our unhoused neighbor populations to some other part and expect the situation to change. So it's a really, I think it's so transformative in like trying to do something that's really uncomfortable, that does not rectify the past and completely ameliorate everything, and say, everything's fine now. We're trying something new, but it really, it's more like, what can we learn from this, and what can we do to bring triage? But I want to relate it to my work within food sovereignty. It's looking at it in an integrated way. I think it's been mentioned here already, just right now by Lee and Sarah around, who does it take? It's obviously, this collective impact, but it's also collective listening, and that's really difficult, to put into action. I want to recognize that we have success already at different sites across the city, which is building even more confidence. And I want to hold our governmental stakeholders, talking about those jurisdictional players, to really show their best sides in this, and understand that the reciprocity of that, we're enhancing our natural resource management. We're hopefully preventing future destruction of sensitive ecological areas, and ultimately we're trying to do the best thing possible and not just ship the issue away where we can't see it or deal with it. So I really want to recognize even the dissension within the room, is prompting us to think deeper and honor that perspective, but not let that be the only choice.
And thank you, Anthony. That's gonna have to be the note we end on, which I think really captures the situation of this is really hard, and hopefully we can use that challenge as an opportunity. So I thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everybody's questions, all of them. Hopefully we touched on some of the major themes here. And really just want to thank you, Sarah, Lee, Anthony, for taking your time, giving it to Bay Nature, and to everybody who showed up tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thanks everyone for the great conversation.
Good night.